Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Hello, I'm going to try that again. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the 24th Annual Board Conference. My name is April Julian, and I'm the Director of Education for CCLA. Many of you may recognize me as a guest speaker in your law or civics classes. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a fantastic talk lined up for you. But before we begin with introductions, I just want to encourage you all to please feel free throughout this session to submit questions or comments. There'll be time at the end or throughout rather, where we'll pause and try to get to some of those questions and comments. So please remember to do that and be as engaged as you possibly can through the chat box there. You should see a little ask a question. You can either ask a question or post a comment in that little area. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to my wonderful colleague and friend, Noa. Noa Mendelsohn Aviv is the Equality Director at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. She's been with the organization since 2002. She's managed CCLA's litigation in courts across Canada, from human rights tribunals to the Supreme Court of Canada, on such issues as racial profiling, refugee protection, LGBTQ+ rights, reproductive justice, freedom of expression and religion, and intersectionality. Noa's advocacy also involves written and oral submissions before government bodies and legislative committees, public appearances, and publications. Noa seeks to enhance public engagement through dialogue, creative advocacy, press interviews, op-eds, and participation in CCLA's education programs. Noa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much, April. Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to have you with us. I wish I could see and hear you all, but I know that you're there, and I know that many of you sent in responses to the survey questions and questions that we sent out, and many of you shared with us the questions that you were hoped will be answered this afternoon, and I'm going to try and do that, and I'm going to refer to some of those questions throughout my talk today. So thank you for your participation then, and as April said, if you want to put up an anonymous question, you will have that option on the chat. Just type it in and it'll give you the option of anonymous, or you can use your name. And I look forward to hearing those questions when we get to question time a little bit later. One of the questions that you asked me in that survey is, what would I say to someone that says all lives matter and continues to do so even after all the evidence is in and has been provided and has been ignored? And then they say back, well, all human lives matter. So that's an interesting question, and what I'm sure some of you are dealing with. I think the place to start may be that courts and human rights tribunals and the Supreme Court of Canada have all recognized that racial profiling is happening by our police across the country. They're recognizing that serious consequences happen to people who are subject to racial profiling and to unnecessary stops by police. And a recognition, in particular in a recent Ontario Human Rights Commission report, that this is having real impacts on people's lives, that use of force is higher and disproportionate for people who are Black and Indigenous and come from other minority groups, and that use of force, even that is not serious, the kind that doesn't get looked at by the Special Investigations Unit, is even more disproportionate with Black, Indigenous, and other racialized people. We also know that in some cases, this kind of racial profiling by police, and by racial profiling, I don't mean something deliberate or malicious, but the kind of systemic treatment of racialized people has also led to serious injury and death in disproportionate ways, in particular, Black men, many of whom have had mental health issues, including Andrew Loku, Sami Yatim, and others. So as to the question, do all lives matter? Well, of course, all human lives matter, but our systems and our institutions and some of the people who work in them don't always treat all lives as having equal value, and that's why we say Black Lives Matter. So what is racial profiling? The definition provided by the Ontario Human Rights Commission is that racial profiling is any action undertaken for reasons of safety or security or public protection that relies on stereotypes rather than on reasonable suspicion to single out an individual for greater scrutiny or different treatment. Racial profiling is based on stereotypical assumptions because of one's race, color, ethnicity, etc. And the Commission has noted, of course, that profiling can happen not just because of race, but in combination with, intersecting with, other forms of discrimination, such as a person who has precarious housing, a person who has some kind of immigration status, a person who comes from the LGBTQ plus community, and so on. So what I wanted to do now is just show you the slide, a quick response that you gave us, whether you know people who have been stopped by police for reasons that are not entirely clear to you. And April, if you're able to put up that first slide, thank you. And what you'll see here is that 2/3 of you said no, and 1/3 of you said yes. You or someone you know has been stopped by police for reasons that are not entirely clear to you. And if we go on to the second slide, then April can share with you some of the stories that you shared with us and agreed to share. There were a few stories that we haven't shared about your experiences or the experiences of people you know that have been carded. April? April, would you be willing to read up that slide for people who can't see it clearly?
Yes, I apologize. My mic was off. Thank you for reminding me. So here are some of the stories that that you've shared with Noa. First, I was carded around my school. The police said they were just checking around. It made me feel like I didn't belong and like an outsider. Another person said, I was in the car last year and was stopped coming back from America. They asked why we went to America and recorded our information. Another story, in 2017, on a class field trip where we went downtown, the police stopped a man and asked for his ID. I have no idea what it was about, but they talked for around 2 minutes. Another person says, I was stopped at a light going to meet up with my friends a year or two ago. They asked what we were all doing and asked me individually in front of all my friends of color if I was safe. They did not explain why they had stopped us, and it was slightly uncomfortable to be asked if I was safe. Another person said, my mom is always stopped at the airport for no apparent reason. She is Trinidadian and has a darker complexion than everyone else in our family, so we have our assumptions as to why this happens. They say it is random, but they make her go back into a separate area. She's examined, asked why she's traveling, and gets her bags rechecked. Another person says their father was stopped for no reason. They asked normal questions for about 5 minutes, but it seemed a bit angry and curious. And finally, an officer questioned by friends when they were sitting in a parking lot in 2019. They asked what they were doing and for their names, but I'm not sure if they recorded their information. It was unprovoked and made my friends upset.
Thank you, April. So what I want to do now is I want to get into the Know Your Rights part of the discussion, and it's going to be based in part on the questions that you've asked me and in part based on questions that I've been asked by other young people that I've spoken to over the years. This is going to be the longest part of the session. You may have other questions that come up, so again, please feel free to put them in the chat. I want to start by explaining that what I can give you here is not legal advice. These situations are complicated and complex. Often the safest thing to do is consult with a lawyer, but I can provide you some general information about your rights and about what happens if you're stopped by police. Because of course, being stopped by police in any circumstance, whether you're speeding and you know you were speeding, whether you are in broad daylight or alone at night, whether you know you've done nothing wrong, it's stressful. And it can lead to tension on your side, and it can lead to tension on the other side. And sometimes things can go badly. And I recognize in saying all of this that police officers can also be young and can also be stressed out, and that too can lead to things going badly, and that some cops do this difficult and dangerous work well, and some don't. And we know about that, and we know the criticisms, and we're going to talk about the things that go wrong today. And I think that that's important to be stated as well. So First of all, knowing what your rights are does not mean that they will always be protected. As I said, policing is a hard job, and police officers who have a duty to de-escalate situations don't always know how to do it or don't always do it. And in some cases, there are officers who have not respected individual rights as they should have because their training wasn't good enough, or it wasn't recent enough, or because they're doing what everybody always does and ignoring the training that only happens for a few hours a year. So although this isn't legal advice, there are a couple of recommendations that I will give you right from the start. First of all, if you find yourself in a situation where you're being stopped by police or questioned or asked for ID, your first job, I would think, is to keep yourself safe. In that moment, the safest thing that you can do is to use your best judgment and to stay calm and respond politely, even if you don't think the other person deserves it. But the more polite you can be, the more you can maintain a cool head and a cool situation, and that's safer for everybody involved, and in particular for you. Second of all, there are some circumstances in which you have to provide your name and maybe your address. And there are also circumstances in which you have to provide your ID, like if you're driving, you have to provide your driver's license. But you do not need to answer questions. You do not need to answer questions. You can wait and you can speak to a lawyer. And that's whether you've been stopped, detained, arrested. That's if they ask you the same question 20 times over. You do not need to answer questions. You can stop, you can wait, and you can speak to a lawyer. If you are not being detained, and I'll explain what detained is in a moment, that means that you are not being held by the officers, not physically, not psychologically, not at all. But the safest way to find out whether you're being detained is simply to ask, am I free to go? Or am I being detained? And if they say that you're not being detained or that you're free to go, the safest thing you can do is walk calmly away. Likewise with a search, and I'll come back to this when we talk about searches, you do not have to agree to a search. And you can say, I do not agree to the search. I do not consent to the search. And the final thing I want to say about safety is that if you think something has gone wrong, if you think you should not have been stopped, should not have been questioned, should not have been asked for ID, if you feel like the officer may have done what they were allowed to do, but they did it in an aggressive or an impolite way, the safest time to complain or to take action is after the interaction is finished. Then you can record and document everything that happened, everything that you remember, the date, the time, the officer's name, the officer's badge number if you can memorize it, the car number, what they looked like, what you were doing during and what you were doing before, the fact that you were not making noise, the fact that you were just hanging out with your friends, what happened afterwards, was there a charge? What did the officers say? Keep a story in chronological order. That will be very useful to you if you need to come back and tell somebody that information, because what you tell as information becomes your evidence. So here's some of the questions that you've been asking. What can police do and what can they not do when they stop you? So we'll definitely get to that. Are they allowed to deny providing identification in certain situations if the police ask you for it? And I think you're asking here whether you can say, no, I'm not giving you ID. So we'll get to that. And that depends on whether you're being stopped but not detained, whether you're being detained, whether you're driving, and so on. And are the police allowed to search you without any evidence? So we'll get to all of that. But I want to start by saying, where do these police powers come from and where do your rights come from? So police are people in our community. We live in a democracy. We all have rights. We're all free to do whatever we want, except for where the law limits it. Police get special powers under law, and that means they're also limited by law. And your rights come from law, in particular from the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees you the right to equality, the right to be free from unreasonable searches or from arbitrary detention, the right to liberty. But these rights are not absolute. Clearly, if a person is speeding at 200 kilometers an hour down a street, police can stop them and say, hey, slow down, and issue them a ticket. In addition, your rights come from the Human Rights Code, which is a legal law that guarantees you the right to be free from discrimination. And by discrimination, I don't just mean that you feel like an officer was deliberately singling you out because of your race, although it could include that. It could also be that you feel like there's a systemic issue here. You know that you've been stopped, you know that you are racialized. You don't know if that's the reason why, but you have a concern. If you think there's a systemic issue, or if you think there's unconscious bias, that too could certainly qualify as discrimination and be relevant under the Human Rights Code. Finally, as another general comment, I need to say that the law doesn't always give specific answers to each and every question. What the law says is often up to interpretation. So sometimes there aren't clear answers, and sometimes there's a difference of opinion about the interpretation between courts and police and rights advocates like myself, and between and also even amongst ourselves. The good part of it is that it sometimes means we can challenge what police do and get different answers. And living in a democracy means that we can also get the laws to change. And that's happened a lot, and we'll get to that at the end of the presentation. It means that the laws can be clarified and interpreted differently by the lawmakers and by the courts. So let's start with detention. This is a situation in which police come and talk to you and stop you from leaving. Do you have to stay with them if you're being detained? Yes, you do. And when they stop you, it means that they are forcing you to stay, not necessarily through physical force, not necessarily through handcuffs or putting a hand on you. It would be enough for there to be psychological detention, meaning that you cannot leave because, for example, 4 officers are standing around you, or that you believe that you're required to stay and there's an officer saying, keep your hands where I can see them. If you are in a situation where you believe that you cannot leave, that is psychological detention. It's not always clear when a situation becomes detention, and the courts have recognized now that many vulnerable groups, such as people who are Black or Indigenous, people in precarious housing, or people from LGBTQ communities who have more contact with police, may be more likely to feel that they have to stay with the police or things will go badly for them. They may be psychologically detained. There's also been a lot of discussion about community policing, engagement of communities, neighborhood policing. And some police officers have tried to say that that means that they should be stopping and talking to people in the community. And others have said, well, stopping and talking to people in the community to say, are you okay? Do you need help? Are you lost? Can I help you? Oh, there seems to be noise or a noise complaint going on here and I need to address it. That might be legitimate neighborhood policing. And some people would say that questions like, who are you? Where are you going? What's your name? What's your address? Where are you coming from? Who are you with? Are these your friends? That those in fact don't amount to neighborhood policing that is acceptable, and that those kinds of questions are legitimate if police have a reason to be asking them. So not all resolved, differences of opinion, but something to be aware of, because we're going to continue to try and get the law to do things the way we think is most fair and just for people like you. If you are driving and police stop you, that is a detention. It's enough that they tell you to pull over, you are being detained, even if it's just to check your license or registration, and in that case, you may not drive away until the police say that it's okay for you to drive away. When can police detain you? When is it legitimate for a detention to happen? Generally, it's allowed if the detention is for investigative purposes, if there is reason to suspect that you are connected to a particular crime, or if the detention is reasonably necessary. If you are detained, if you are not permitted to leave, or if you believe reasonably that you cannot leave, then you have certain rights. You have the right to know the reason for the detention, and you have the right to speak to a lawyer. So then the big question is, well, how do you know whether or not you're being detained if police just come up to you and say, keep your hands where I can see you, or they stand in front of you on the path, or they stand next to you on a path, or they say, hey, come here. Do you have to listen? Do you have to stay with them? What if they ask you questions or ask for your ID, or say, keep your hands where I can see them? Is that a detention? So as I said, the answer is not clear. The safest way to get an answer is to say to the officer, am I being detained? Or am I free to go? And depending on that answer, you should be able to walk away at that point. So there is a regulation in Ontario that talks about arbitrary stops that don't have a legitimate reason, and collecting information in certain circumstances. Police are no longer permitted in Ontario to just ask questions to collect identifying information from you without a reason. And that reason doesn't have to be a strong reason, but that reason cannot be just because of your race or just because you're a young Black man. It cannot be based on the fact that you refused to answer a question or wanted to walk away. Nor is it a legitimate reason for them to stop and ask you for your information just based on the fact that you're in a high crime location, because that high crime location might also be your neighborhood or your friend's neighborhood or where your school is. If you are stopped and asked for identifying information, you have a right under the Ontario regulation to be told the reason for the stop, although there are exceptions, and in those circumstances they may not have to tell you. You also have the right to be told that you don't have to provide the information, but whether they tell you or not that you have that right, you have that right. You don't have to answer questions other than, in some circumstances, your name and perhaps your address so that they can find you again. If you are stopped, even if you're not being detained, if you are stopped, you have a right to be offered a document containing the officer's name and identification number and the date, time, and location of the attempted collection. You have a right to receive a document, or to at least be offered a document that contains information about how to contact the independent police review director, and it's at that office where you can make a police complaint. And on that document, you should get an explanation about how to find out what information police have collected about you under Freedom of Information Acts. You can do that anyway, but if you're stopped and questioned by police and they take your identifying information, they should be offering you a document at the end that helps you figure that out. One question we've been asked over time is, what if I run away when I see police approaching? So the answer is that in some circumstances, running away could provide a reason that justifies a detention or an arrest. Not always, but sometimes. So if you see police approaching and you have not been detained, then you are free to walk away, and it might be safer than running. And this is going to be up to you to use your best judgment. Maybe you have a reason to run. Maybe there's an emergency. So, do you have to answer questions or provide information to the police? Generally, as I said, the only times generally you do not have to answer questions. Not if you're being detained, not if you're not being detained. Here's some of the times where you do have to provide your information, at least your name and possibly your address. If you're being ticketed or if you're under arrest. And that doesn't have to include that you knocked over a gas station. It could be enough that you had a light out on your bicycle or that you jaywalked. The officer can give you a ticket, and on that basis can then ask you for your information. And in fact, we know that there have been situations in which officers have gone looking for jaywalkers in order to have a reason to ask them for their information. And if that happens to you, and if you think that there may be something wrong going on, you can certainly find out about it through a human rights complaint, or try and find out about it and make a complaint. We'll talk about that at the end. If you don't provide information when you were supposed to, when you were required to by law, this is an offense and you could be charged with obstructing the police. If you're driving, even if it's for something small like providing a license, you do have to provide your license, your vehicle registration, and your insurance. So if you're not required to provide information to police, if you're not required to answer their questions, can you lie to them? The answer is no, not by law. Misleading a police officer is considered an offense of public mischief, and it also could be considered a form of obstructing a police officer. If you do answer questions, that information can be used against you. As you probably all know from TV, that's an American rights reading section, but it's true here as well. If you ask to speak to a lawyer 15 times and they don't provide one and you start to answer their questions, that information can be used against you. So you can simply and politely say, I do not want to answer any questions until I speak to my lawyer. And you can also not answer questions after you've spoken to your lawyer. Generally, other than driving, even if you have to give your name, it doesn't mean that you have to provide your ID. You generally do not have to provide that to the police. If you choose not to speak and not answer questions, that cannot be used against you. So things are a little bit different under COVID because COVID changes everything. Under COVID, there's one other circumstance in which bylaw officers, not just police officers, but city bylaw officers, municipal bylaw officers can ask you for your ID. And that is if they think that you've broken an emergency rule. Well, we know that there are a lot of emergency rules out there and they're not always clear. Here too, you don't need to answer their questions, but you will need to provide ID. So if you can't lie, can police lie? Well, generally, yes, they can lie, trick, or mislead you in order to get information from you, although there are certain restrictions. And can police break the law? Also, yes. There are restrictions, but the police do have special powers to break the law while they're investigating an offense or enforcing a law, but only if they have special permission from a superior and they reasonably believe that breaking the law is appropriate in the circumstances. What about searches? Can the police search you? And this is one of the questions you asked as well. Well, let's start by what is a search, because it may be a little bit broader than you realize. A search is not just them going into your house or them going into your bag. A search can also include going through your pockets. It can also include looking at your cell phone or your computer. It could also involve bringing a sniffer dog around to sniff at your bag to see if, for example, they can detect drugs, or a pat down just on the outside of your clothing can be considered a search, or it could be a lot more invasive, like a strip search or giving a breath sample or DNA, anything that's taking information from you. When can police search you? So as a general rule, police cannot search you. They don't have the power to come up and search you just because they feel like it. They need either a warrant or your consent. So we'll come back to consent in a moment because that's really important. But here are some exceptions. If an officer has reasonable and probable grounds to believe that you have something in relation to an offense and they need to perform a search urgently, they can do it. For example, they see somebody running out of a store waving a gun with a bag of loot and something under their jacket, that might justify a search. You may reasonably expect privacy in your car, but if you're pulled over while you're driving, the police can conduct a plain view search of your vehicle, and based on what they see in your vehicle, they could then continue and do a more invasive search. If you are arrested, police can search you. They don't at that point need a warrant. They do not at that point need your consent. If you've been arrested, they can search you for weapons or for evidence related to the arrest. And if you are being detained, they can conduct a pat-down search of you in order to keep everybody safe. If it's a more invasive kind of search, like DNA or a strip search, then there are more restrictions. For example, they would need to bring in an officer of the same gender to do a strip search. Searches have to be conducted in a reasonable manner. They should not be abusive, and they should be appropriate and proportional to the circumstances. And if they've simply arrested you and there's no other reason, they can't automatically just strip search you for that reason. So if one of the ways in which police can search you is based on your consent, your agreement, what does that mean? If an officer comes up to you and says, "Can I see what's in your bag?" in a way that sounds like you have to agree, and you open your bag, you can have a very serious argument afterwards in front of a court whether or not you agreed. If you turn over your bag, if you open up your pockets, that could well be seen as consenting to a search. If police show up at your house and say, "I'd like to take a look around," and you open the door, or "Let me in, I want to come and see what's in your house," that could be seen as consent. So if you don't consent, the safest thing you can do for yourself to protect yourself legally is to say, "I do not agree to this search. I do not consent to this search." And that's kind of important. And sometimes police officers have also even been known to say things like, hand over your bag, and if you don't say anything, they'll say, well, the person didn't object, you handed it over. Rights advocates would tell you that that's not real consent, but the law is interpreted by the courts. The courts have many times agreed with rights advocates, but in many cases also don't get to the courts unless police find something. So again, your safest bet is to say clearly, I do not consent to the search. So what if police search you anyway? Well, first of all, as we said before, stay calm and polite as much as you can. Some searches without consent are legal, so that this may be a circumstance in which police do have the authority to search you. If you try to stop the search or block the search, and that search is legal, you could be charged with assaulting the officer or obstructing a police officer. And we'll talk again in a few minutes about what other kinds of things you can do. There are circumstances in which an unlawful search that leads to criminal charges could ultimately lead to the result that they cannot use that evidence against you. So I think that's the end of most of the Know Your Rights questions that I had from you and from other circumstances. So this would be a good time to take a pause and see if there are any questions that have come in. April,
No, we have a question from one of the students.
Mm-hmm.
Says, do you think some police funding should be relocated to other services to better deal with special situations? For example, police are typically called to deal with people who have mental health problems and are putting themselves or others in danger. Do you feel like allocating more funds to de-escalation training is needed, or should there be an entirely separate entity or group to deal with that sort of thing?
Great. Was that the only question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So thank you for that question. It's a great one. It's something I'm going to get to a little bit later on. Yes, there are a lot of calls right now to defund the police, and by that, it's a pretty provocative term, but I think most people by that mean that resources that are being given to law enforcement should be given to upstreet problems for communities that struggle in different ways, and part of that certainly should go to having mental health professionals dealing with mental health situations. And having spoken to a lot of police officers about it, I think that many officers feel that they too did not go to police college in the hopes of dealing with mental health situations. They don't feel like they're expert or specialized in it, although some of them believe that there are dangerous situations, and that's why they get called, and that's why they feel like they're the only ones who can deal with certain kinds of mental health calls, but we know that many mental health calls are not dangerous, and mental illness does not necessarily make somebody dangerous, and that's a stereotype that needs to be addressed. But there are other kinds of resources as well that perhaps should be taken away from policing and put into communities, whether it's education or social welfare or social work or dealing with kids in schools. And so I think that we have gone a little bit off the rails in our society, and how much power and how much responsibility and how much information is handed over to police rather than trying to solve issues in other ways, and also trying to prevent issues or in order to and support healthy communities and healthy neighborhoods. Okay.
We have another question, Noah.
Mm-hmm.
So someone's asked, do police complaint mechanisms work? Are officers held accountable?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're going to get to that in a minute, but I'm okay to skip ahead now. I'm glad you asked it. The answer is not very well, and not very often. There are police officers who've been caught on camera, who have, in Canada, in which a person has ended up killed, and there has been no accountability for it, and there has been no disciplinary action taken. There are some exceptions, but yes, the mechanisms don't work very well. And what we're going to talk about in a moment is, does that mean we shouldn't use them at all? Certainly it means we can improve on them and try to make them better. But that would be my answer. Okay. So let's go then to the next slide. And this is the question of accountability. If you had a concern about police conduct, would you do anything about it? What can you do? So I'll provide you some of my answers, but I was really interested in some of the answers that you gave. So April, do you want to share?
So this is some of the feedback from students about if you had a concern about police conduct, would you do anything about it? So some folks said yes, and the question then was, what would you do? So for those who said yes, they said they would make a complaint about the officer, that they would take their story to the media or share it on social media. They might participate in protests against police brutality, start and sign petitions. And another person said they would tell their dad he's a police officer and could probably help. For those who said that they wouldn't do anything, the question of why not was answered. I feel like it would not make much of an impact. Another person said they're unsure of what to do. I was unsure of what the police interaction was about. And another person said the person who was stopped wanted to avoid drama during the interaction, so she continued to just be patient and calm.
Great, thank you. So I think those are wonderful answers, and I think it's wonderful that you got to some of the options that are available to people. When it comes to police complaints, although those mechanisms have not worked very well and a lot of people gave up on them, and I think it goes beyond just the question of it's not worth it, it doesn't do anything, it doesn't create an impact. I think there's also a sense of vulnerability that people have. If you complain against the police, is there going to be some kind of retribution? Will they know and will they come after you? For that reason, we do have a body in Ontario, the one I mentioned earlier, that does provide a separate place for you to file your complaint. But ultimately, if you file your complaint with them, that complaint does get investigated, generally by police. There are other things to consider if your complaint is not just for your own sake, but because you think that there's an issue here, a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. If there were a greater volume of police complaints, would it be harder for police to deny that there's a problem? Whether it's a complaint about a particular division, which I've heard about, or a complaint about a particular officer, which I've definitely heard about. There was one place that I used to go out and speak to some young people, and they all told me about the same officer. And if complaints aren't coming in, it's harder to fault the supervisors in that division for not taking disciplinary action, because accountability within the police service needs to be not just against a particular officer, but against the system. What are they doing in addition to training during the day-to-day operation of the police to try and make things better? And what ought they to know? So the onus should be on them to monitor their own officers. But if they're not hearing complaints, it is harder for them to get some of that information, as I'm sure you can understand from your own life and your own circumstances. But for all that, yes, the mechanisms have not been very effective. Another complaint body, so not a complaint body, but a review body is the Special Investigations Unit that investigates situations of serious injury involving police or death or sexual assault. And there too, it's a body that doesn't work particularly well. It's been criticized. Justice Michael Tulloch, who spoke yesterday and gave the keynote address, has talked about how ineffective it is. And for a long time, the SIU wasn't even publishing the names of officers or publishing their results. They were only giving information to the police service boards that were asking for the information and asking for the results. So there's a lot that needs to change. If there were a volume of complaints, the Office of the Independent Police Review Director can not only investigate specific complaints, they can also start their own inquiries. So if they were to get a large volume of complaints about a particular issue or a particular division or a particular systemic problem, they could decide to initiate, even based on one complaint, they could decide to initiate their own inquiry and go deep into it. And they have done, and they've produced some interesting reports and some useful results. And of course, for the purpose of data collection, if those complaints were there, then the public could ask for information about them. And that's important as well. So there may be an advantage to it. I don't know, because that's not how it works today. Other options that would be available to you, we started to talk about earlier, would be a human rights complaint. Human rights complaint is a sort of mini form of litigation. You could go to a human rights tribunal, and essentially that complaint is like legal action against the police saying, I've been discriminated against. And as I said earlier, that form of discrimination doesn't have to be the person used a racial slur against me, although that would be included too. It could also be, I was targeted and I think it's because I'm racialized, and there's a bigger problem because I think my friends also had the same issue, or because I understand that the courts have recognized that racial profiling is going on. And what's helpful about that form of action is there is a body called the Human Rights Legal Support Center, whose job it is to help people with their initial complaints figure out where to go. Sometimes they'll help with forms, sometimes they'll help with legal advice, sometimes they'll provide legal assistance. So you could certainly at least make a phone call to the Human Rights Legal Support Center, and they certainly would be interested in issues of racial profiling and other activities on the part of police. The other option that some people have taken, especially if there's been some kind of harm, is a civil suit. In other words, a regular lawsuit, sometimes in small claims court, for example, where it's easier to be unrepresented, to go after police for the harms that they've done. If you're able to discuss those options with a lawyer, it's preferable. If there is a possibility that your interaction could lead to charges against you either in the moment or even after the fact, then you probably want to think very carefully about when you want to file your own complaint, if you want to wait until the possibility of charges or the charges have been taken care of, and the safest way to do that is to talk to a lawyer about the timing. And as I said earlier, you're going to use your best judgment on keeping yourself safe. Usually the safest time to do anything is after the interaction. So if things are getting heated between you and an officer, you may think twice about saying, I'm going to sue you, I'm going to go after you with a human rights complaint. But that's a decision that you're going to be making for yourself. So what about recording the incident? Can you record it using your phone or video? The answer is yes, you can, and I know some people have heard differently from police, but as long as you do not interfere with what the police are doing, as long as you don't get in the way and obstruct them, you may record events that are plainly visible in public places. And police officers cannot require you to show them photographs or videos that are saved on your device without a warrant. They may not delete your photographs or your video under any circumstances. And if they ask you to stop recording, you can politely remind them that taking video or photographs falls under your charter right to freedom of expression. If you want more information about your rights to record, we do have a toolkit on filming the police on the CCLA.org website. You can go and find it there. And Abby, I think you're here, so if you want to put the link up in the chat, I bet people would appreciate it. Whether or not you recorded your encounter with the police on a video, you can still write down everything that happened after the fact, including before, during, and after, including any tickets, warnings, charges, and so on, as well as writing down their names and badge numbers to keep as a record for yourself to help remind you so that you have that testimony you can give afterwards if it's relevant. And keep in mind as well that if you have had an encounter with police in which that is voluntary, in which you're free to go, you're not detained, but they asked you for identifying information, they should be giving you a document, or at least offering you a document at the end of that encounter that includes the reason for the stop. If you are injured, you can seek medical attention immediately, and you can take photographs of your injuries and ask for your medical records. So the final slide that we want to look at before we get to last Q&A session is what needs to change. So if we can go to that last slide, April, if you don't mind sharing that with us. So here we have a number of really wonderful suggestions that you've put up that include things like, defunding aspects of police roles, complaints, protests, petitions, and so on. So I'll let you read that for yourselves. So maybe we can keep that slide up for a minute. Some of the practical things that you can do are on that slide. being involved, sharing information is certainly important. And knowing that change can happen. One of the questions that you provided to me when we sent around the survey a few days ago is one of you asked, what changes have happened after Black Lives Matter? And I love the question, but I want to tell you that changes have been happening and rights advocates have been advocating for longer than Black Lives Matter. It's a fairly new movement. Rights advocates have been advocating for decades, since long before I came on the scene, and I've been doing this for a while. Some of the changes include that Ontario regulation that I was mentioning earlier. The reason it exists is because people fought for it. The Andrew Loku inquest that looked into the police shooting of this Black racialized immigrant man who had mental health issues, the inquest happened because Black Lives Matter fought for it. And then a different group of advocates fought to make sure that the inquest addressed not just issues of mental health, which is where they planned on going, but also issues of race. Most recently, there's a law that is going to require police and other services in Ontario to collect race-based data about their own activities so that the public can look at the police and see what they're doing. And also fairly recently, in 2019, the Supreme Court of Canada made a very important decision, R.V. Lee. That was in a case involving 5 young men that were hanging out in a backyard, and police came along, entered the backyard. The young men were not seen to be doing anything wrong, and the police said as much in court. The police entered the backyard and started questioning them and asking for ID, and then asked one guy to keep his hands in front of him where the police officer could see him. And the police officers tried to say afterwards, well, we hadn't detained them until much later. We hadn't detained them until one guy started to run and we chased after him. And the Supreme Court in 2019 said, in response to many of the interveners that were there, in response to things that the courts have increasingly known, they said, yes, there's racial profiling. Yes, people are vulnerable. It doesn't matter if you live in a big fancy house or or some kind of public housing. You have a right to privacy in your backyard. You have a right to be free in your backyard. You have a right for police not to enter without asking. And if they do, there's a chance that that in and of itself amounts to detention. So that's everything that I wanted to share with you about the fact that change can happen and we can make it happen and we can continue to make it happen. So I'm really pleased that you came to this talk and that you wanted to hear about it. And I don't know if we have any other questions that have come in.
I think we've had a question that you've covered about can I film or photograph police officers?
Great.
And we'll give the students a bit more time perhaps to catch up and think of some more questions they might have.
For sure. So while you're thinking, one of the things that I wanted to share with you about that decision in R.V. Lee, and it's pretty shocking, the police tried to say to the court, well, when we come in and speak to people in this neighborhood, people in this community, and some of the racialized people in this community, they have frequent contact with the police, and so they're pretty sophisticated about it, and so they know that they're not being detained. They know that, what we're doing and when they're free to go. So that's why it's not a detention. And groups like CCLA and others came to the Supreme Court and said, think maybe the opposite is true. If you come from a racialized community, if you come from a community that has more frequent contact with the police, you may also know how vulnerable you are. You may also know that things can go badly. You may even know somebody to whom that's happened. And so when police, or you may have been in this scenario before and you know that there's no point in fighting it because when you've tried before, it didn't work. And so when police ask you questions, the easiest way to get out of that situation and be able to go home and feel comfortable and safe is just to answer their questions and leave. And a lot of people have that talk with their parents, where their parents say to them, just say yes, sir, no, sir, answer their questions and get out of there and come home. So although the lower court sort of accepted that argument about, if you come from certain communities, you know about police interactions, and so you're more sophisticated, and that means it's not a detention because you knew you could leave, the Supreme Court said no, that's simply not the case. It's an interesting decision. I recommend it. Yeah.
Sorry, we have a few more questions that have come in.
Sure.
So one, what happens if police illegally search me and find evidence?
Mm-hmm.
And the next, are there any reports or resources you can suggest reading for people that want to know more about discrimination in the criminal justice system?
The second one's a big question. I'll start with the first one. If they illegally search you and find evidence, the answer, as it often is in law, is it depends. In principle, the answer can be, in some circumstances, that they are not going to be allowed to use that evidence against you. By breaching the charter, by breaching your rights in that way, it would bring what's known as bringing the administration of justice into disrepute. In other words, people would be so shocked and horrified the police could have behaved this way, and we should be shocked and horrified, even if we're not surprised, that sometimes some police officers behave this way. And therefore, our whole system of justice gets called into question if they can do whatever they want and then use that evidence against you. And that's why sometimes that evidence can be excluded. There are other times where courts are going to say, well, it wasn't that bad a violation, and well, this evidence is really important and it was a really dangerous crime, and so we're going to allow that evidence in anyway. But there are times where it can be excluded. As to the question of reports or resources you can read, oh boy. Yes, I would suggest looking at the Ontario Human Rights Commission's reports, their inquiry into the Toronto Police Service. There was an initial one that looked at use of force against racialized people. And there was a second one that came out more recently, also about use of force and about racial profiling, but all of it in the context of their inquiry into racial profiling by the Toronto Police Service. Strongly recommend those. Justice Michael Tulloch has written, I think, 2 really good reports, one on police accountability mechanisms in the province, and those I think are very well worth reading. And I think R.V. Lee spelled L-E from 2019, the Supreme Court of Canada, also tells that story and tells us what the courts are now understanding. And what's interesting as well about the evidence of racial profiling in R.V. Lee is that the courts are not requiring anymore, at least not in that case, they're not requiring the individuals to bring evidence each time of racial profiling. They do not require the individual to come forward and bring a whole bag full of books or articles saying, here, I'm going to prove to you that there is racial profiling going on in society. At this point, the court said, we know it. It's been proven. It's known well enough. Those are the ones that come to mind for me at the moment. But there are new initiatives coming out. The Ontario Human Rights Commission writes about them quite a lot, and that's worth watching. And of course, there's an anti-racism directorate, which is a product of the Ontario government that has some initiatives going on about anti-racism in general and about some of the measures that are being taken. So that's what I would recommend. And thank you for asking. I'm glad that you want to learn more about it.
Thanks, Noa. Yeah, we have a few more questions coming in and about 7 minutes left to get through them. So the first, can police search my cell phone if they are detaining or arresting me? Another person has asked, when can the police come into my house? And finally, do I have to give the police ID if I'm riding my bike?
Oh, Abby, thank you for putting up those links. That's amazing. So if you are riding your bicycle, as a general rule, no, they should not be able to ask you for, never mind your ID. Generally, they shouldn't be able to ask you for your ID at all, unless you're driving a car or a vehicle, a motor vehicle. If you're riding your bicycle and they say that they're going to give you a ticket for some kind of infraction, and there are probably a lot of infractions that a lot of us do when we're riding our bicycles, even if we don't have the appropriate lights on our bicycles and it's starting to get dark, for example, or we don't signal properly. If they're going to give you a ticket, they can ask you for your name. And they can ask you for your address in order to identify you. When can police come into my house? So I don't know as much about searches in homes, and I don't think Abby's going to be able to jump on the call. She knows more about that. But generally, as a rule, the answer is if they have a warrant to search your house, and even then, it has to be appropriate to the circumstances. Also, if you consent, so if police show up at your door and say, can we come in a way that you feel a little bit scared about, there may still be a question as to whether or not you consented if you opened that door and let them in. And there may also be exigent circumstances, in other words, sort of urgent situations that allow for them to search. But beyond those sort of general statements, I wouldn't be able to answer. But if you don't want police to come into your house and they don't have lawful authority to come into your house, I would recommend don't let them in, because once they're in, they can look around. And based on what they see, they can conduct a further search. If the police officer is family members and you want them in your house, or they're friends of yours and you want them in your house, or you're in trouble and you need help and you've called the police and you want them in your house, you should, of course, feel free to do that. Can the police search my cell phone if they are detaining or arresting me? I'm not 100% certain, but my understanding is that a cell phone, that if police are detaining you, what they can do without any other reason, but if it's just because of the detention itself, what they are entitled to do is simply a pat-down search to make sure you don't have weapons or something else that could endanger somebody's safety. So it wouldn't be about collecting evidence if they are simply detaining you. A detention is supposed to be for a brief period. If they are arresting you, then police can do a search, not only for weapons, not only about safety, but also for evidence. So if that cell phone is relevant to the evidence that they're looking for, so if, for example, they think that you've been involved in drug dealing and you've been using your phone to do it, and there's a concern that if they don't get their hands on that phone soon, you're going to dispose of it, throw it out the window, it'll get smashed by a car, and they won't be able to get the evidence that they need of that crime that somebody's been involved in, then that might justify at least taking your cell phone, not necessarily doing a search on the spot, and then holding it until they're able to get the information that they want from it. That's my understanding, but I haven't looked closely at the question of cell phones. Anything else?
I think for now that's the only questions we have. You've covered quite a lot.
And I see that Abby's added some additional really wonderful resources. Apparently the University of Toronto has a really good expert report, and as well a resource on when police can enter your house or business. And thank you actually for that reminder. If you do have specific questions about your rights, CLEO is an amazing community legal education Ontario clinic whose entire job is to provide legal information to people, and they answer a lot of these questions. They answer them in a great deal of depth, which means it's confusing and complicated because it depends on the circumstances, and so they're trying to provide all of those different circumstances to you in the information that they're providing. But that steps2justice.ca site is going to provide you more than just when can they enter your house. It's going to provide a huge number of answers to a lot of different questions, which is terrific. Okay.
I think we're pretty much right on time, Noa. So thank you so much for that really engaging and informative talk. You've given the students obviously a lot of really great information. And Abby, thank you as well for sharing some resources in the chat. Thank you to all the students who are participating in the chat and also for submitting your survey answers in advance so that we can make this session as relevant to all of your real lived experiences as possible. I hope you've taken some information away that will help you better understand your rights. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to the CCLA and check out those resources in the chat there. We'll make sure that your teacher has access to this video and to all of those resources as well. Thank you all for joining us. We will see you again tomorrow for your next session. Have a great day, everyone.